Okay, so then without much ado, let's discuss today's talk. And today's discussion is mainly going to be on the first, the very basic question, which a lot of our patients and clients often ask us is, why did I gain weight? Why does one gain weight? So that's what we're going to discuss today in the first part. I will take you through the journey of a person right from before their birth to adulthood to their old age, of what really happens in terms of the science and physiology and what really impacts the weight of a person. So Chirag, let me ask you this question point blank, right? Why do we gain weight? What's your view on anybody gaining weight and becoming obese?
So I'll tell you two things.
Yeah,
Hi everyone. So if I talk about my past experience with weight gain and all, I used to think people just used to gain weight because they were lazy and they used to just eat more randomly
yeah,
and they used to gain weight. But when I studied more about obesity, I handled thousands of clients. Now I finally understand a part of it, not fully yet, that weight gain is a very complex process.
right,
People gain weight out of their habits, their childhood traumas, uh, their environment, what society they are in, what kind of products they keep in their house, um, what are their habits, what kind of content they consume,
right.
how fast they order their food, what kind of food they like. Weight gain depends on lots of reasons, along with the hormonal problems in the body.
Absolutely. I think you summed it up before we begin. So that's the thing, what the moot point here is that weight gain is far more complex and far more nuanced than what we generally consider, right? It's not a disease of somebody who just, you know, eats more, moves less. I think that fundamentally has to change, right? It's a complex disease. In fact, we're not fully understood the entire science behind it. We're just beginning to understand some basics of it. Now, what we have done is today's session, we'll divide in two parts. One is the weight gain during early childhood and the childhood, and then the adulthood, right? Why are these both important? Because I think if you see a person from a journey from their own childhood, you get a sense of what are the complexities and nuances of the entire system. And sometimes you see a person gaining weight in their adulthood, like Chirag said, the root of that might be during the childhood, right? So that's also very important to understand how it really goes about. So let's first understand how the weight gain process happens in the childhood. In fact, if you see science more deeply, you'll understand that some of these things even happen before you're born, right? So this concept is out, right? At least, at the end of this session, we should all have this out of our mind, that eat less, move more is one of the reasons for, for helping your patients with obesity, but it's not the only way, right? This is one way. So conceptually, right, the opposite of this, that is, eating more and moving less leads to obesity, is one aspect of obesity, but it's far more complex and nuanced than the entire process, right? Okay. Also, another common thing, obesity happens to lazy people, is also something we need to uh, throw it out of our mind, right? Obesity is not about laziness, right? Obesity is not about somebody's, lack of motivation or lack of desire, right? It's, again, there are challenges which a person faces in his or her life, which also impacts this, right? Also, and this is one quote which is, I think, very useful, I would say. If losing weight was just about willpower, then a chocolate cake would be classified as a controlled substance, right? So, and it's not, right? So it's not only about desire. It's not only about willpower. There are other aspects of it. Yes, willpower, desire, self-control are very important, right? They're fundamental and anchor points of obesity management, but they are not the only ones, right? So let's see how it starts, right? So it's a complex endocrine disease. You have genetic factors, you have hormonal factors, there are developmental programming, something called fetal programming, a very interesting science behind it. There are some neurological influences, there are environmental exposures, and what Chirag said, what you keep in your house, what are you connected with, what are the substances you use, also has very interesting impact on weight. And there's a huge ecosystem within you, the gut microbes, right? The small bacteria living within your intestine, which also have a very important role to play in weight gain. Okay, so it all starts like I said, before the birth. So there are two aspects of weight gain which impacts you even before you're born. Now, it could be your genes, or it could be something which is called fetal programming. Okay. Now, Chirag, you have seen people in your life who, who have a very strong family history of, obesity, right? So, you have their parents are obese. There'll be families of clients of yours, right? So there'll be, the father, mother, children, their aunts, all coming to you, right? So I'm sure, you'd have seen some connection there in terms of the genetic aspects of also. So what's your view on generally the genes impacting somebody's weight, the genetics of it?
So
And
gen
any interesting anecdote you'd like to share if there's any there? Yeah.
so on in my family itself, like on my mother's side, everyone is overweight, and they
Right.
always say we eat less. We don't eat
Yes.
much. In fact, even when I saw my mother gaining weight, I don't remember her eating too much. She
Right.
hardly used to eat like two chapatis. That's it, like a normal meal. But it's in the genetics.
Right.
Clearly, we can see in some families.
Correct. Right. So if you talk about genes, right, there are two sub aspects of it. One is monogenic, that is single gene defect, right? So there's some unfortunate people who have one gene which is so defective that they are destined to become obese. But for most of us, like Chirag said, like his family, my family, right? My in-laws' families, right? There are people who are clearly obese, right? Often it's a complex interplay. There are polygenic inheritance. So there are multiple genes which impact a person, and that multiple genes in consortium lead to obesity. Okay. So then there are certain, like I said, monogenic disorders, right, where you have a single gene defect that leads to obesity. Now we see some of these patients in our practice, right? And again, a good doctor will recognize monogenic disorder. These are all, of course, these are like zebra. Everybody knows what a zebra looks like, but rarely does one see, right? But once you see a zebra, you know it's a zebra, right? So it's a, even a child who has never seen one before can easily recognize. So these are diseases which are relatively rare, but you do see them, do come across them once in a while, even in your life when you're dealing with obese people, right? You will be coming across some of these cases, and these are the people who require specialized care. So you need to be recognizing them, and you need to then refer them to the right specialist. So there are certain conditions called a melanocortin 4 receptor mutations, the most common cause of obesity, right? And often these children are having obesity very early in the life. Secondly, a very important group of disease, and there is a doctor in UK. She's from Pakistan, and she realized that when she went to UK, she recalled some of her learnings early in her medical career in Pakistan, and she realized that there are a lot of children who actually fit into this criteria of leptin gene disorder. And she went back and she studied the children in Pakistan, and there is a huge population, there's a huge cohort of people who had this one particular genetic disorder called the leptin gene mutation. So leptin is basically a signal that goes from your from the adipose cells that are there in your system to your brain, saying that you have enough fat. Now, in some people, this signal is disrupted, leading to a genetic early obesity. And then there is something called a POMC gene mutation, which leads to a very particular type of obesity. We just recently saw a patient with exactly this mutation, right? They also have other hormonal problems, and they often tend to have a pale skin, and some of them have red hair, right? So this is a very typical form of monogenic obesity, and these generally present to pediatricians, to doctors who deal with children, and often again a good eye is required to recognize these early on. Typically, these often have extreme hyperphagia, right? So unlike what Chirag said, his mother would often say that she doesn't eat enough. Some of these children actually have hyperphagia, so they eat a lot. You would have heard about a condition called Prader-Willi syndrome, another genetic cause of obesity, where the child eats so much that the parents often have to lock lock the refrigerator. Otherwise, the child would often go and keep eating, right? And they'll eat almost literally to death, right? So that's the hunger. So they don't have any satiety. There is constant hunger. Uh, Again, they tend to have rapid weight gain during early childhood, and often these present early on, so before the age of 5 years, right? So these are all often, and sometimes since these are genetic disorders, you'll find similar pattern in their some of the family members also, which again need to be looked at. There are certain some associated. Some of them are autistic, there could be some associated condition also with them, right? So you saw the recent Amir Khan's movie Star as Zameen Par. There were children who actually, I mean, there were people who actually fit into some of these disorders there as well. So that is something which is something you need to recognize and again deal with them with empathy and also help them as the best possible way. But majority of the people that you're going to see in terms of the genetic obesity, it's also true for type 2 diabetes, is polygenic. Polygenic meaning there are multiple genes. So it's basically multiple genes which impact. So you don't know what you inherited, but you inherited a few of them, which ultimately, along with the environmental influence, ultimately lead to obesity and weight gain. So there is most of the family genetic disorders, familial obesity that you see is most of the time polygenic, where you have multiple genes impacting, leading to obesity, right? Okay. Then a very interesting aspect really is something you need to understand, and this is very important for Indians to understand. So there is a cohort of doctors from the UK who actually started studies on this, and I'll tell you where they started learning this. It's called developmental origin. There's a scientific term for it. It's called developmental origins of health and disease. Now, there's one doctor in India who has done extensive work on this field. His name is Dr. C.S. Yajnik. So you can search for him. You can actually Google for him, and you can actually probably see some of his YouTube videos. Fascinating. This guy has, I think probably one scientist where I have deep respect for in my field is Dr. Yajnik. He's done fantastic work in this field. And the basic idea, which Dr. Yajnik and some of the other experts in this field have been saying, is that Indians tend to have, some sort of fetal programming that happens when you are in your mother's belly. And that often is something that leads to problems later in the life, right? Now, let me give you the stark example of this and where this entire story started. So this story actually started, and there's a very, like I said, a very fascinating tale behind it. It started with the Dutch famine in 1944 and 45. Now, Dutch, Holland, right, Netherlands was under, at that short period of time, under the Nazi occupation, right? So Nazi Germany occupation during the Second World War. And this Dutch actually revolted against the Nazis. The Nazis were particularly brutal on them, right? So they cut off their food supply, they cut off the supply of their, essential supplies for them. And there was a very massive food shortage during this period in Holland, right, in Netherlands. And what happened as a result of that was that, well, the adults somehow managed, but the people who were most impacted were pregnant mothers, right, who were expecting, right? So these pregnant mothers, well, in generally, remember, this is a European country which generally rich with a lot of supplies, but this short period of time they were actually stark poor, and these pregnant mothers actually have very little nutrition. So they themselves were, of course, half starving to death, but they were carrying a fetus also, which was also being impacted severely. Now, the interesting thing was that this actually, lasted for a very short time, and then Germans lost the war, and suddenly when they lost the war, Holland went back to where it was. Recovered very fast, right? So they went from an extreme starvation environment to an environment where there was ample of food available, right? So what happened was that some of these pregnant women who had not delivered, right, came from extreme starvation to ample of food, and some of them who delivered, their children went from a completely famine environment when they were fetus to an environment which was abundant with food. So if you see this contrast, of course, it played for a very short period of time in Holland. In India, this is something which is playing for a slightly longer period of time. Not only India, the entire colonial, entire Eastern countries which were under colonial rule. You can see this contrast often happening. So what is happening is that for example, the generations who are a few generations above us, where probably their mothers were before India's independence, they were in an environment where the food was not secured, and then India became independent. You had the wheat revolution, the milk revolution, and so on and so forth. And these children who were born during that time in a more of a famine sort of situation went on to a situation where there was ample of food. right? So hence, there was a sudden increase of obesity. The same thing happened in uh, Holland. So they followed up these children who were born during that time, and they found that early gestational exposure to famine ultimately increase the risk of obesity in later on in these children. And they also had greater risk of type 2 diabetes, greater risk of cardiovascular disease, and so on. Now, it's a very interesting story, right? Now, what Dr. Yajnik, so this was the original studies which were done in the UK about these cohort of people. And when Dr. Yajnik went to the UK, he said, Arey, I've seen this before, right? This is in India. This is exactly the story of India, right? Where you had a situation where the Indians were in a, sort of a, food problematic state to a food excess state. And this is being played out in a very long frame in the Indian context. So what his theory was that, and this is the theory which has now stood the test of time, and it has been proven beyond doubt. So what his theory is that you are born with certain genes, but because you are in an intrauterine environment where you don't get enough food, there are certain genes which get switched off. And this switching on and switching off of gene is called as epigenetic phenomena, right? Again, please remember this term because it's a very important term if you're dealing with this field. Epigenetics is something you can't control, but this is basically switching off and switching on of certain genes. So the environment feels that the child is going to be born in an environment where this food is going to be lacking. So the body switches off certain genes, which are, in a sense to protect the child in an environment which will be more harsh. But contrary to what we were expecting, the child is then born in an environment where there's ample of food. But unfortunately, certain genes have been switched off. So the child is born in a different state earlier and is in a different state now, and hence in future is at a higher risk of developing diabetes. So what Dr. Yajnik did was he followed up some of these villages in Maharashtra where you had similar situation, and he followed these children up to a long time in areas surrounding Pune. And what he found was that these children indeed were having higher risk of developing diabetes. In fact, they developed diabetes much earlier compared to a lot of the other children. They also became obese much earlier. So this is an unfortunate situation which happens. What his ultimate theory was that there is some sort of, again, a capacity issue, right? So when you're born underweight, you're born with smaller livers, you're born with smaller kidneys, you're born with smaller number of adipose tissue. And then you go in an environment there is excess of food, you ultimately end up with overstuffing of the entire thing and leading to more weight gain and leading to more insulin resistance and other problems later on in the life. So what happens before you're born also impacts what happens in future, right? So, and these changes happen because of epigenetics. Again, both excessive low birth weight and excessive high birth weight is also, both of them are linked with obesity later on in the adulthood. So people who are born, with underweight children who get more food later on are also more likely to develop obesity later. But there is something called gestational diabetes. You have heard of this term, where pregnant women become diabetes transiently during their pregnancy, leading to child being larger, and this larger child is also more likely to develop both diabetes and obesity in future, right? So there's a U-shaped curve over there, right? So if the child is born both underweight and overweight, he or she is more likely to develop obesity in future, right? Again, if you look at, once the child is born, what are the things which can impact obesity? So one thing which has been, again, if you had seen earlier, when we are growing up, when we are doing our, medical education in MBBS, there's a big, a government push to promote breastfeeding. It's still there. So one of the things which, science has taught us is that breastfeeding, up till, the prescribed period of time is good for the baby because it does two things, right? It gives the natural food which the baby should have, and it also protects the child from obesity in future. So those children who have been given formula feed early on for whatever reasons tend to develop more obesity later on in their life, and this has been well proven in a lot of studies where they've followed up these children for a long time. And another very interesting phenomenon, which is again a more recent thing, is that early antibiotic exposure. So if the child has been exposed to an antibiotic early in their life, they are more unfortunately likely to develop problems later on in their adulthood, right? Now, earlier it was not known what was the reason, but now it's very well known that taking antibiotics changes the child's gut microbiota. right? The bacteria which live inside their body, and hence they go on to develop problems later on. And the third aspect is that the children, like I said, we already talked about fetal programming. The children who are born underweight, they rapidly gain weight immediately after their birth. These are also the children who are more likely to develop obesity and other complications later. Then, of course, comes the mid childhood, right, where you have this entire obesogenic environment. So you have sedentary behavior these days. Children, right, do not exercise enough. That's like, this is typically eat more, move less type of thing. Television viewing, just this fact, viewing television while eating, right? We have seen plenty of children, my own children do this. Unfortunate, but they do, right? This in itself has been linked with obesity. They live in an environment where food is ample, right? I mean, who really denies child of food, right? Not nobody, right? So they are any child, right? In a typical middle class family will get enough food as much as he or she wants. Nobody's going to say no to that. Then, of course, there could be medical factors. Some children, have asthma. They take a lot of inhaled steroids, right, which can also impact their hormones and other things. What Chirag talked about is called endocrine disruptors. We'll talk about this in more detail. And very importantly, food is often used as a reward, right? We'll talk about this thing as well, right? So let's discuss another big epidemic which is happening in parallel. And Endocrine Society in the US has been very vocal about this. This is called endocrine disruptors, right? So there are chemicals in the system, chemicals in the entire, in our own day-to-day systems, which tend to have some sort of effect on the hormonal system, which can ultimately lead to obesity. Now, for you and me, for me and Chirag, it's not going to impact us. But for a child who is just 3 years old, who is 2 years old, for them, exposure to these kind of chemicals can be potentially problematic in future, right? So these are called endocrine disruptors. I'll give you some classic examples of that, and you would have heard about these in lay news also, in local press also. So bisphenol A, you would have heard about bisphenol A. There are a lot of, if anybody has worked in the Europe, there are a lot of EU regulations about plastics. And a lot of these actually deal with a compound called bisphenol A. This bisphenol A actually has some sort of hormonal disruption, which has been very well established and linked to be associated with obesity. In fact, now, of course, you don't see, but earlier, we used to have that thermal printers where the credit card slip which comes out. That thermal printers also used to have bisphenol A, and that also, there's some residue which will remain unless you wash your hand properly after using that, and that was also linked with obesity, right? There are certain pesticides and herbicides which have been known to produce obesity. There are flame retardants which are used in your sofa and other things in household equipment to prevent them from catching fire, have been very well linked with obesity, and cosmetics, right? There are a lot of cosmetics which have linked with obesity as well, right? Of course, these are all things which we can't control, but it's government's job to really study and investigate and propose solutions to that. Of course, a lot of Western governments are already been very vocal about it and doing a lot about it, but Indian government is also doing good steps about in these things, and they keep checking for these substances and whether they have any kind of impact on a child's growth and lead to future obesity. But again, this also has been linked with the same, right? And one behavioral issue which we all do, both as parents as well as uncles and aunts to children, is use food as a reward, right? This is highly detrimental. Chirag, would you agree? Food as reward, right? What's your take on this?
Yeah. And also this food as reward is coming from the same famine state because our grandparents have been through those times. They think
Yes, yes,
we did
yes,
not eat that food, so now our kids should eat that food.
right. And any views on the endocrine disruptors? Have you come across any of these things?
Yeah, I have been studying about that,
Yes,
especially some of the perfume, some of the
yes.
material in soaps and hand washes, especially. Those are causing some issues in people.
Yeah. So there is a lot of science behind it, and sometimes we don't know, but a lot of people are now investing their time and effort, scientists, for studying these things, right? And let's come back to food as reward, and this is a very pertinent behavior, like Chirag said. Our grandparents always came from an environment where food was not that sufficient, and even today, we all tell our children that okay, homework kar lega to tumhe chocolate milegi, right? Ye karega to you'll get this food, right? So we all often use food. Food is the cheapest reward, right? I mean, but and we often use that as a reward. And what that does is in the child's mind, right now, when the child is frustrated, is tired, and you tell them that, okay, you do just one math sum and I'll give you a chocolate, right? So immediately his brain connects that there's a dopamine surge that happens after he finishes his work and gets a chocolate. So when he grows up, right, he self rewards himself that, yeah, if I do this, then I'll go for a dessert, right? So that becomes a automated link, right, in their brain, and they get this dopamine surge after doing that. So it's a very, it has a negative impact for the rest. Even I'm sure, just if you close your mind and if you think, right, we have also gone through this, right? There are points of time where we had said that, look, I do this and I'm going to, treat myself to a dessert, right? That's we have done this to ourselves, right? Let alone to our children also, right? So that's something which is a very common problem. Another interesting aspect, you would have had, I'm sure some of you would have patients and clients who are in the pubertal age, right, where they just hit puberty, and you would have seen a lot of these cases where, you had the child, who is otherwise thin, right, and suddenly hits puberty and suddenly starts gaining a lot of weight, right? So puberty is a period where some of the children, especially with certain genetic predispositions, tend to develop insulin resistance and gain rapid weight, right? So that's a very common period of time. And again, contrary to this, and this is a very interesting phenomena, right? I have two children, both of them are girls, and I see this in their peers and colleagues, right? So my older child is 12-year-old. The actual age, where this pubertal issues often come. A lot of the children in our class, right, have had early puberty, right? Some of them actually are patients also, right? Now, what happens is, interestingly, in girls, when they are, overweight early in their life, they tend to have more of these adipocytes, and this adipocytes converts the testosterone into estrogen. And remember, girls, the female sex hormone is estrogen, and this estrogen often leads to early puberty in girls. So obesity leads to early puberty. This is a phenomena that has been constantly seen across the ages. So if you see the onset of puberty, onset of having periods in terms of data, from somewhere from 1920s or 30s to 2025, over the past 100 years, you would see that the age at which the periods are starting are going less and less and less. It's called a secular trend. There's a trend towards it. Right? This is very, very dangerous and very alarming, because what happens is, what we don't realize is that when you have early periods or when you have early puberty, your bone also fuses faster. So these girls end up with not only excess weight but lesser height, and we all know the impact of that as well, right? So this is a very, it's a slow epidemic which we all need to watch out for. And if you have children, right, this is something you need to keep in mind. And just for your knowledge, average age of having periods is 12 and a half years, but now that age is coming to lesser and lesser age, as the time passes, right? So this ends the first part of why does one gain weight from a childhood perspective. Now we'll see the adult perspective, right? So there are genetic reasons, both monogenic and polygenic, fetal programming, right? What happens in the intrauterine environment, early childhood influences, childhood, what happens during childhood, right? So using food as reward, sedentary behavior, and so on, and pubertal changes, all of which impact the child from becoming obese, right? So Chirag, any views of yours on this first part before we go ahead?
Also about the early puberty thing, I think that's why we are seeing PCOS, PCOD cases as well, very largely among female population nowadays.
Yes, yes, very large number. Exactly, right? In fact, another silent epidemic is PCOS, right? PCOS is very, very common these days. And again, a very common issue linked with that, right? Yeah, and adolescent PCOS is itself has a lot of connotations and a lot of issues which we'll deal with, right? Okay, so we'll discuss this. We have a long course of 5 parts. We're going to discuss all of these things at leisure. But now let's look at people of our age, right? What happens during adulthood, right? So now we talked about a child gaining weight, but now let's talk about lot of your patients and your clients. How do they gain weight, right? And what are the issues that they face, right? And I'll say a simple word, Chirag: life happens, right? So a lot of the times, those. I mean, life is tough, right? So we go through difficult things in our relationships. Sometimes it's your family. You you get a new job, you lose a job, you have financial issues. Life is tough, right? We all know that. And if our life's only goal was to be fit, maybe we would have done a great job. But what you have to do is you have to remain fit, at the same time live your life as well, right? So it's a tough challenge, right? So it happens to all, right? Not that we feel sorry for ourselves, but it is at the same time very important that when you have clients and when we have people whom we deal with, your patients, you need to have a little empathy for them, because what they are going through, probably at some point of time either we will go through that or we already gone through that in our lives as well. So we'll see how an adult typically gains weight. We'll see all these parameters which are listed here in a little bit of more detail. But I think one thing is this picture, right? You'd all seen this famous movie Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum, where this was there are buttload of jokes across years, right? And even now, this is an era before memes, right? And even now you have memes on this. So in this movie, you had this obese child, right, who went on to become Hrithik Roshan in his adulthood. Really does not happen, right? In reality, the obese child unfortunately becomes an obese adult, right? That's the reality. So I think the first and important thing is that a child who is in the child somebody who's obese in their childhood uh, generally starts with a disadvantage, right? Starts with the fact that where they go on to develop obesity in future, right? Not many of them are able to become Hrithik Roshans in future. So that's something you have to keep in mind. Also, here as well, very lean child also often become obese in adulthood, right? There's a very interesting paradox which happens in this situation as well. Another important thing, and this is, I think, one, if you ask me, if there's one defining reason why obesity is an epidemic, it's food and all is great, right? I understand, right? Food, excessive food in the environment, I get that. But I think a bigger problem, again, which we don't recognize, is sedentary behavior. And when you talk about sedentary behavior, it's actually, much simpler than you think. It's actually prolonged sitting. Now, majority of us have a job which requires sitting, right? What kind of any form of job, whether you work as a doctor, whether you work in banks, or whether you are, a cab driver, or whatever. There are a lot of jobs where sitting is the norm, right? You're just sitting, basically. You're not standing. If you see now, I think Chirag is also standing, right? When I do have to give a talk, I make sure that I don't sit, right? I stand, right? So this is one thing which I have learned, right? Whatever extra time you get, yes, Chirag.
I'll just add one point. So I
Yes,
used to give seminars by sitting all the time. And what
yes,
mostly seminars used to happen after dinner or during dinner time. So after eating food used to make me acidic and I used to feel bloated. Uh,
right.
from last few weeks, I started that I will only do standing video calls and standing seminars, and it
Yes.
improved a lot. My digestion improved a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is one, great take home here. I mean, wherever you can stand, right? Now, in fact, at one point of time, Chirag, I'll actually contemplate this. It was a crazy idea, right? My hospital put that down, but I'm still, somewhere going to do it. I said, when I'm going to consult, right? I'm going to consult standing. Okay, this is one thing which, we tried to make some system where it works out. Somehow didn't work out for a hospital, but fine. But in future, I know somewhere I'm going to try this out, right? Well, again, I'll encourage my patients when they come, right? If you could stand, great. If you're old, you can't, right? Great. You take a couch, right? I'll stand for you, right? That's what I think somewhere in our own work, if you could get a little bit of standing, that works. And in fact, there is ample of evidence here. So what we'll be doing, we'll be put a lot of materials on the technology platform. We'll put some, important studies here as well. There are now plenty of studies, right? You can search for it on PubMed. There are plenty of studies which have shown that sedentary behavior, sitting, has been linked with not only increased obesity, but increased risk of cardiovascular disease, increased risk of diabetes, increased risk of other complications, including Alzheimer's, including dementia, old age memory loss, right? So these things are linked with sitting, just sitting, right? So at least right now, what I do is, since my job requires sitting, wherever I get an opportunity to stand, I stand. But at the same time, at frequent intervals, generally at 40 minutes, I put a 40-minute timer. Every 40 minutes, I take a little break. I walk around my hospital, right? Come back and sit, right? And that again, like Chirag said, it helps me also, right? It helps me overall, be healthy. I do take a little break, come back, recharge, right? A small break, and the next patient who comes is really probably gets a big smile from it, right? So that's how it really works, and it's something which I would suggest you do it yourself, right? Not only leave it for your patients and clients, right? So that's something which is very important, right? Then, of course, you have these hormonal causes of weight gain. Again, uh, if you're working in the obesity space, you need to recognize this and then refer them to the right doctor. There is one insulin resistance cycle. We'll discuss that. Uh, Underactive thyroid, hypothyroidism. Uh, Interestingly, I'll tell you one thing here. This is overrated, rather, right? So hypothyroidism does lead to weight gain, but majority of the patients actually have very mild hypothyroidism and or underactive thyroid, and that generally does not contribute to the weight gain, but patient often thinks that it's because of that, right? So if you measure the TSH for your thyroid function, and TSH typically, if a lot of patients have TSH of normally up to 5.5 to 5 is considered normal. So if your TSH is somewhere 6.5, a lot of patients attribute the weight gain to the TSH of 6.5, which is probably not the case, right? In fact, it's the other way around. People who are obese tend to have a slightly higher TSH, right? So that's a myth. If you have a TSH of 30, 40, 50, yes, you will gain weight, right? But milder increases of TSH does not generally lead to weight gain, and that's something which we need to understand. Then there is a condition called Cushing syndrome, rare condition, generally rare condition, but it happens because of body's own steroid production. But what also happens is steroid exposure from outside, right? Now, if you have ever, practiced in a rural or suburban area, you know that there are a lot of doctors and quacks which often prescribe steroids, right? So be very careful. We have seen ample of these cases, right? In fact, every day we see one or two cases where we have iatrogenic Cushing, meaning that somebody gave this person a steroid, or the patient has been taking it for a long time without anybody's knowledge, and that leads to obesity and the other problems, right? Growth hormone deficiency, very rare. Hypothalamic tumors, very rare, but I'll tell you an interesting story here in a minute. And hypogonadism, that is reduction of male sex hormones and female sex hormones. Now, male sex hormone decline happens very slowly, but female sex hormones decline very rapidly during something called a menopause, right? So that's the period of time where they gain weight. I'm sure, Chirag, you would have seen clients of yours often have this low sex drive, and men low sex drive and weight gain often interlinked. Do you see that people coming with
Yes,
this
yes. So
combination? Yeah.
I won't reveal the company name, but there is a company in sexual wellness, and they
Yes.
refer clients to us, and
Yeah.
mostly only the overweight client face those issues.
Right. So there is a link, right? So there is, it's again a bidirectional link. So a lot of these things have a vicious cycle. Yeah? They have so weight gain often leads to low testosterone and low sex drive, and that often leads to more weight gain. So it's a vicious cycle that comes into the system. Now there is this one cycle, if you have to understand, it's the insulin resistance vicious cycle. We have a whole course on insulin resistance, so I'll not bore you with the details of the entire thing, but I'm going to tell you some basic thing here. What you have to understand is that this is also known as the, again, Dr. Yajnik has done work on this. This is called the YY paradox. It's also, there's another paradox which is very interesting. It's called the sumo wrestler paradox, right? So a lot of us, you'd have seen sumo wrestlers, again, if you've grown up in, like I've grown up as an 80s or 90s kid, you'd have heard about WWE, which used to be very popular. There used to be a sumo wrestler there called Yokozuna, right? Obese guy, obviously, but a lot of these sumo wrestlers are actually far more healthier than most of the Indians. The reason is there is fat in the subcutaneous, right, tissue, and there is fat intrinsic, right, inside your body. Now, the fat inside your body is more likely to produce insulin resistance than the fat which is beneath your skin, right? So, sumo wrestlers tend to have more of subcutaneous fat and less of visceral fat, but Indians have exactly the opposite. We have less subcutaneous fat, so we look thin, and we have more visceral fat. That is the bad fat that ultimately leads to a lot of complications. So the problem is you're born with a limited number of fat cells inside your body. And if this fat cells often get filled up very fast. So that extra fat gets stuffed into this limited number of fat cells. And when that happens, that leads to insulin resistance. And that's all you need to really understand. But that's a very essential point you need to understand. That insulin resistance, you'd all heard this term insulin resistance frequently. Insulin resistance basically happens because the limited number of fat cells that you are having is stuffed with more fat than it can take. And that is the crux point of the whole problem. And that leads to this insulin resistance. So when you have excess of insulin, this extra insulin is anabolic in nature. So this extra insulin leads to more weight gain. So that's a cycle which becomes a very complex cycle. Now, talking about some rare causes of weight gain, is a very interesting. There are two interesting stories I'll tell you. This one, in fact, we published this when I was a resident in endocrinology in Delhi. In Ankara, we actually published this paper called Kumbhakaran. Right, you've all heard about Kumbhakaran, right? Kumbhakaran is a mythical character from Ramayana. His life was basically, he was a huge giant. So basically, he was Ravan's brother, I think. Yeah. So you wake up, in any time, right? You just wake up, he'll kill a few people, right? He'll eat and he'll go back to sleep. Okay. And so there are a lot of stories about Kumbhakaran, right? What we propose, and this was just basically some sort of endocrinology and art letter to in a very reputed journal, which got a lot of traction. Did he suffer from a problem of hypothalamus? Now you have this hypothalamus in your brain, which actually controls, it's a master control of the food intake and satiety, right? So it'll tell you when you are hungry, it'll tell you when you are having enough food. Now, some people who have a tumor in the hypothalamic region, they don't have satiety. Right? In fact, very interestingly, when you create mice models for obesity and diabetes, what they do is they knock off their satiety center in the hypothalamus. And what we proposed was that Kumbhakaran, looking at his, how he presented, actually had a hypothalamic lesion, a hypothalamic disorder, which actually this it might be actually true, right? If you see from that, we have written, I think right now I have close to more than 50 plus research papers. Chirag, the interesting thing is, clickbait, this is before clickbait journalism, right? The one actually got the highest traction. The people who came and interviewed me several times was this article, which was actually basically supposed to be some sort of a side take or a lateral thing or a joke. They actually published this at that point of time Times of India as on the front page, right? That Kumbhakaran's sleep was probably curable, and probably they suffered from obesity, which is great. I think there was a very interesting aspect of it which looked at. And then many years later, we have as a sort of a corollary, as a follow-up of this, again dealing with obesity, where we said, Humpty Dumpty, right? You all heard about this, little nursery rhyme. If you see Humpty Dumpty's entire nursery rhyme and listen to it, it actually resembles Cushing syndrome, right? So this Humpty Dumpty, had a great fall, right? And all the king's men, horses, all the king's men could not put Humpty again. There are very interesting anecdotes and stories behind Humpty Dumpty, but again, our theory there was that he suffered from Cushing syndrome, right? So the idea here is that if you find somebody who is like a Kumbhakaran, right? Why Kumbhakaran? Because this patient, there was a patient of ours who actually had a hypothalamic disorder, and he used to get admitted very frequently in the hospital. And one day his wife was so frustrated that he said, "Ki ye sir, ye Kumbhakaran jaisa hai. ये पूरे दिन खाता रहता है." Now this guy was such a problematic person that he would keep asking for food, then he would fight with the hospital authorities saying that you didn't give me enough food, right? Poor guy actually suffered from a hypothalamic lesion, right? And his wife was literally frustrated with him कि मैं इसका कितना खाना बनाऊं, right? ये कुंभकर्ण है, ये खाता रहता है, सोता रहता है और कुछ काम नहीं करता है, right? And that's where we got this idea that maybe even Kumbhkarna also, poor guy, suffered from hypothalamic disorder, right? So again, just interesting anecdotes, but again, if you find a Kumbhkarna as your patient or a client, or if you find a Humpty Dumpty as your patient and client, please refer them because they could have additional hormonal problems which need to be corrected. A lot of medications lead to weight gain. Some of these antihistaminics are all about allergy medications. Allergy medications often lead to weight gain. Very important, and a lot of people abuse this, right? There are certain psychiatric medications which often lead to weight gain. Steroids, glucocorticoids, and certain diabetes medicines. There are certain diabetes medicines which you're going to see later, GLP-1 and SGLT2, which produce weight loss. If you have a client, or if you have a patient, it's very important to see what kind of medication which these people are taking, right? Because there could be medications which they're taking, which is probably detrimental to them in the journey to weight loss. Sarah, have you seen any cases like this where you had patients on certain medications which led to problems?
Mostly SSRIs.
SSRIs, yes, correct, right?
So
So,
we
and
work like mental health doctors in our board for the same
Yes.
reason, because weaning
Yeah.
off, tapering off, that is very necessary for the weight loss part.
Absolutely, right? So there would be, antidepressants, antipsychotics. Olanzapine is a very, we don't use that. A lot of people don't use it anymore, but it's very notorious to produce rapid weight gain, right? So these are all problems. Sleep, right? Both sleep deprivation and obstructive sleep apnea has linked with obesity, right? Again, another very important epidemic. And again, this is, when I was in Delhi, at that point of time, Noida just hit with something, with a new job market where you had a lot of call centers suddenly mushrooming in areas of Gurgaon and Noida. And we used to get plenty of young people with type 2 diabetes because of this very fact of sleep, disruption, the circadian rhythm disruption. In fact, this change in the sleep cycle is a very, very important and, potentially curable reason for obesity. Of course, then you have this problem, right? And this is a very common thing. We talked about using food as a reward. This, if you had to ask me, apart from the sedentary behavior, one more thing which modern world has brought, which leads to obesity, and it is this. So there are two types of hunger. We have the stomach hunger, which is the actual hunger, right? So you would have heard पेट में चूहे दौड़ रहे हैं. That is stomach hunger. Brain hunger is when your body feels that you are hungry, but you are actually not physiologically hungry, but you eat something and you feel better. So stomach hunger is fine. Brain hunger or the head hunger is the problem, right? Now, evolutionary point of view, God has given you or nature has given you, two systems, both linked, right? One is eating food for survival, and other is eating food because it gives you pleasure, right? Now, interestingly, we are no more in the survival phase. People do not, starve themselves to death these days, right? For whatever reasons, right? Good reasons. But we overeat ourselves to death. That is what we're doing, right? So that actual starvation, stomach hunger, very rarely have we really experienced in our life, right? Very rarely. But the brain hunger, we all recognize it immediately, right? You have this time where you're going somewhere, right? Or you're tired, you come home, right? You're not really hungry, but yet you eat something. You have that last piece of chocolate cake that was lying from yesterday, or that pizza which you ordered yesterday and still lying in your refrigerator. You have that. And you feel better. That's basically head hunger, right? So if you have patients and clients, try to ask them to recognize this difference, right? When they're about to eat something, and yes, Chirag,
So right now, what happened? It's raining heavily in Bombay and Pune.
yes,
My client texted me in the evening that she's feeling like eating bhel puri from the street. I told
right,
her the exact same thing, that it's your brain asking for the bhel because of the weather. If you
yes.
notice these patterns, you will be able to control easily.
Exactly, right? So what is required at this point is cognition, identify that is this a real hunger or is this something I made up in my mind, right? So that's the thing, right? Exactly. So just sometimes even recognizing this pattern often helps you to defeat this pattern, right? So that's a very interesting example which you said, right? So this is what happens. And then of course you have other causes. Now, one cause which is emerging to be very important is the gut microbes. We still don't understand this very completely. And there is a lot of quackery also behind this. In fact, there's some sort of a push by some people about this. Please don't fall for those traps also. But let me tell you the science behind it. And one interesting thing, and I'll tell you, Chirag, you remember, earlier you used to have all these sugar-free, sweeteners which used to be there. There used to be certain, famous models, like I think it was Lara Datta or somebody who used to, promote this, saying that this, they show them being very fit, and they say that you have this low calorie sweetener or so on and so forth. That this because of this I am healthy, right? Remember any of these ads? Seeing this, right?
Yeah,
These ads
yeah,
have suddenly gone away.
yeah.
Yeah.
All the
I,
same.
I'll tell you why they've gone away.
Mhm.
Somewhere in the early 2010s or 2015s, there's actually a paper, right? A seminal paper where in published in Nature, where what they did was they actually, did studies in mice where, they gave certain mice the natural natural sugar, and they gave the other mice this artificial sweeteners. And they actually found exactly the opposite, that the mice on artificial sweeteners actually gained more weight than the ones who were taking actual sugar, right? Now they were perplexed because they were expecting something opposite and something other happened, right? So then they started, trying to study why it happened. And what they recognized was, and which was completely contrary, they didn't expect this. What they found was that the mice who were on these artificial sweeteners, their gut microbes actually changed. And these gut microbes changed to something that was actually more harmful to the mice for gaining weight, right? In terms of gaining weight. Now, that begs the question whether artificial sweeteners are good or bad. That's an open debate, right? That's still not been cleared, because then after that, there were certain studies which showed that they were weight neutral. They did not lead to weight gain or weight loss, at least in human studies. The point is that the fact that if anybody tells you an artificial sweetener saying that this leads to weight loss is wrong. It doesn't. So that's a fundamental point, and that's why, even if there was a push when, Coca-Cola used to push Coke Zero and other things very much a lot, they themselves realized that, while it is, slightly better than selling actual Coke, to sell this as a health product could be a problem. It could backfire later on, right? So that's why they stopped doing this as an ad. They give it as an alternative, but they don't put it as something which is healthy in a sense, right? And all these things fundamentally happens because there are bacteria within your system which also impact the weight that you gain, right? Secondly, we live in an obesogenic environment. You like it or not, food is everywhere, right? You see food ads everywhere, right? You go out of your house and you find a nice little cheesy burger ad somewhere, right? Again, you have this head hunger, right? Suddenly you feel hungry even if you're not, right? So we live in this environment. Remember, and this is what I tell every patient of mine when they are on the journey of weight loss. I tell them that you are swimming against the tide. It's going to be tough. It's not going to be easy, about it, right? So it's not easy because you live in an environment where food is everywhere. Nobody sees food as a problem. And, smoking, yes, if you are smoking, there'll be, every minute somebody's going to tell you not to smoke. But if you are eating, excessively, nobody's going to tell you to stop. So we live in an environment where if you want to lose weight, everything is against you except you. Just keep that in mind, right? Of course, sedentary lifestyle and childhood patterns. So these things we already discussed, right? So that's the thing. And finally, this is the last slide where we then go from childhood to adulthood to older age. Now you'd have patients and clients who are old. Old age, particularly in the present era, leads to another problem, which is known as sarcopenic obesity. Sarcopenic obesity means that they are obese, but they also have less muscle mass. This is disaster, right? With a big T. Okay. So there is loss of muscle mass and there is more fat. And this is fat and muscle consortium. So what they've done is they looked at all these people who had this sarcopenic obesity, and these are the people who die the fastest because of any reason. It could be because of a fracture. It could be because of a COVID infection. It could be because of some pneumonia. It could be because of diabetes. It could be because of heart disease, right? Those with sarcopenic obesity are the worst. So when you have patients who are older, right, it's your duty not only to help them lose weight, but also to strengthen their muscle because they face this dual crisis, right? Chirag, any take on this sarcopenic obesity?
This is the one of the most problematic thing happening in India right now, because
Yeah.
anyway we never ate enough protein. We did not work out in during
Yeah.
those period, like from 1980s to 2000, and those people are now
Yes.
turning old, and they are facing this
Correct.
issue usually. They are still
Right.
not working out, and even if they start right now at the age of 70 or 80, they will get benefit out of it.
Correct. Right. Yes. So, and again, Chirag, another misconception which a lot of older people have is that they can't really do, any sort of weight training when they're old, right? Which is wrong. I think, in fact, they're the people who need to work harder to preserve their muscles, right? And that is where a bit of, weight training is also essentially important, of course, to the level that, they don't injure themselves, right? That's also equally important, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
also they need higher amount of protein intake as well compared
Yes,
to.
and protein intake, right? So both. So yeah. So just to summarize, and this is the last, right? We looked at the entire journey, right? So why do we gain weight? Well, we don't gain weight just because we eat more and move less. We gain weight because there could be genetic reasons for it, right? There could be intrauterine programming, which you have absolutely no control over. Your early childhood, antibiotic exposure, rapid weight gain, formula feed, so on, right? Maybe childhood infections, childhood asthma, right? Maybe early puberty, maybe pubertal hormones hitting you. Maybe there are some instances where you had, a sedentary life during as a child, right? Food was being used for you as a reward. So you have all those things against you. When you grow up, life hits you. You have a sedentary life. Sitting is the new smoking. Your job requires you to sit all the time, right? You live in an obesogenic environment. There are gut microbes against you. There could be medications which could produce weight gain, right? Sleep disturbances, insulin resistance, hormonal problems, all these things lead to weight gain. So again, I think all we need is that when you see a person who is obese, don't think of it as a unifocal, unidirectional one thing, problem, which if he sort it, he'll become thin. No, there are complex issues all interplaying, right? And everything is for that person to lose weight is against the tide. He has to swim against the tide literally to really reach the ultimate goal. So it's much more complex and difficult than we think, right? And what we need at this point, before we go into what we can do, is to have empathy for these people and to understand that they as human beings did not always choose to be where they are, right? It were often circumstances which led them to where they are, right? So that's the reality. Okay. End here. We'll be happy to take your questions, and Chirag will be happy to take your views on that. And again, just before that, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll allow you to unmute and ask the question. So Neeraj has already raised his hand, so we'll allow him. But before that, Chirag, any other thoughts you'd like to share?
I think I'll take directly Q&A. So.
Okay, yeah, we'll take the questions. Okay, so you have Dr. Sumedha who has asked, can we recognize the cause for sarcopenic obesity, especially when they know that they can't do weight training aged people? I think Sumedha, would you agree, Chirag? This is a misconception that older people can't do weight training. What's your
This
take on
conception is here because we feel older people are very weak and they
that? Right.
cannot lift a kg of weight. But if
Mm,
you look practically, they are already lifting a veggies bag, which is 4 or 5 kg. Like they walk
right,
around with it. They lift
right,
half kg, 1 kg container in their kitchen. So they can
right.
easily start weight training with the resistance band with 1-2 kg of dumbbells. We
Mm,
already keep coaching such kind of people. It just they need a complete supervision because their joints are weak and they might get injured.
yeah. Yes. So I think it's a misconception that they can't do weight training as long as they can do it with under supervision and with with a proper trainer or coach with all safety parameters. In fact, they should be encouraged. In fact, one of the very important treatment for osteoporosis, that is weak bones, is also strengthening their muscles. Uh, Sana has asked, Chirag, I have a patient who has all parameters are okay, still there is weight gain. What could be the causes? Now, Sana, you know that all these causes which we discussed, right? Anything else you'd like to add?
Also, one more thing, people report their food intake very highly wrong sometimes. They think they are eating very less, and if you drill them hard, like you will, if you ask them, they might be adding some hidden oil calories. They might be adding some, like they will tell you they are eating just 2 chapatis. But if you
Right.
ask them what the chapatis are made of, they will tell you that they are adding oil in the flour while
Mm, mm,
making
mm,
that
mm, mm,
atta
mm.
thing. So those are hidden calories. Try to find out if they are eating some extra calories, and that can be your answer.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. Uh, Rekha has asked, is prolactin linked to obesity? Yes and no. Prolactin is linked with, insulin resistance and metabolic issues. But prolactin needs to be very, very high just to be a single most cause for obesity. Often, if they have very high prolactin, they could be associated pituitary tumor where they could have other hormonal problems also. So I would probably look at it in a more, broader sense. Yeah, Kishore has asked about the rest of the session. So Kishore, what we're going to do is This was the first session. Second session, we are going to discuss about the parameters which you use for measuring obesity. So we'll talk about all the all the metrics behind it. It'll be a very interesting session. And the third session, we'll discuss the diet, exercise, lifestyle measures, sleep, everything. And then we'll go on to the treatment in terms of medications, right? So the fourth and fifth part will be about medications, the modern medicines which are available for obesity management, right? So I hope that answers. Uh, Vitamin D and its effect. I'd say it's a Sana, vitamin D and its effect on weight gain. I'll say it's a dual thing. Not much hype was made about it, uh, but it's probably everything is not true. But yes, it does have a little bit of impact as far as the muscle and the that complex is concerned. But in itself, vitamin D deficiency leading to weight gain is something which is again oversimplification. Uh, Yes, Dr. Chirag has asked about best method for body composition analysis. Chirag will discuss this in the next session. So please hold on to that. Uh, Anonymous has asked Dr. Mohan's annual diabetes conference. They have a habit that after every session, audience will stand up and clap. This is to prevent prolonged sitting. Very interesting. Chirag, anything Okay, you run an organization. Is this something which you'd like your people to do?
So honestly, my people will do it because they understand the fitness
Right.
community. But when I
Yes.
give seminars in corporates, they feel shy about doing it. Like
Yeah.
they don't feel comfortable doing it. But it's a good thing. Everyone should try to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good idea. Good idea. Yes. So yeah, I mean, kudos to Dr. Mohan, right? It's a great idea, and that we should be doing it, right? Like, there's something which is strongly encouraged. Again, at least we should, knowing about it, the people who do should at least do it. What about natural sweeteners? Rohit has asked about stevia and monk fruit. Well, they're slightly, again, we can say off the hook, but at least what I'll say, Rohit. My take on this ultimately. Well, let's of course discuss. We have an entire session on lifestyle, diet, exercise, everything. But what I'll say as far as a take on this, Rohit, is that essentially what I feel is that when you have any sort of artificial sweeteners or sugar substitutes, uh, they may not lead to weight gain themselves, but do not consider that they're going to lead to weight loss, and that selling of that idea is a problem, right? Chirag, would you agree?
Yeah,
Uh,
I'll add some points here. See
yes,
what happens. First of all, with stevia or monk fruit, the studies are less compared to aspartame or sucralose.
correct.
We don't know yet if they are natural, but as safer as those other things. But always use your artificial sweeteners just in a cup of tea maximum, or maybe if you want to add some sprinkle on your bread or something. Don't make sweets out of it or something like that. Otherwise, you will end up consuming same amount of calories and it won't
Right.
help.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great. Yes. So again, what I'll say is a little oversimplification in terms of thinking should be thing. I think this is a broad understanding. Again, as Indians, we should be doing broadly. That don't think of things in unidimensionally, right? So अगर artificial sweetener ले लिया मतलब मैं healthy हो गया, वैसा नहीं होता. Even if it's stevia and monk fruit, just anything, maybe moderation is good, and maybe using it for a little bit of taste is great, but don't think of it as the best thing after sliced bread. I think unfortunately wrong connotation, but that's the thing, right? Okay. How effective is intermittent fasting? Dr. Mohammed will discuss that in one of the upcoming sessions, so we'll leave for that. Syed, are there any gender specific differences in development and management of sarcopenic obesity? Do you see this, Tara? Males and females, older males and females, is there a difference in terms of how they come with you know weight gain and muscle loss?
With females, we see more of a subcutaneous fat on their
Yeah,
body.
yeah,
But with the men, we see more visceral fat.
yes,
Men are at the more risk at the end of like
yeah.
uh,
More, yes. So more active fat, and that they're more at risk of the complications because of fat, which is true. And as far as the muscle concerned, the interesting thing there is that men do not have, well, even if it was thought, but they do not have an essential andropause. They do tend to retain, depending on different men, they tend to retain their testosterone for a while. So if probably they may be at an advantage to some extent compared to female who actually lose their almost quickly after menopause. You'd have seen their entire body structure change very rapidly. That's an unfortunate thing. So there is a sex difference in that sense, but men, when they grow much older and they hit some sort of an andropause, the testosterone levels go down. They also, do tend to develop a similar feature. But the only thing is, female, there is a set cutoff point. Men,
Also,
fortunately, yeah,
plus men have like more muscle mass by nature, so
overall, right? So start off, yeah, yes. Yes, so there is a sex difference, I think, to understand. Uh, Someone anonymous has asked, somebody on antihistaminics and antidepressants trying to lose weight, what are the things they could follow? Well, we'll discuss strategies in a while, but I think, one good idea, of course, antihistaminics is not to be abused, that is for sure. So if your patient has been abusing antihistaminics, just tell them to stop, right? Trying to find out if there is a specific reason for the allergy and maybe treat that. There are now this entire, immunology and allergy and is a specialty in itself. Maybe consider meeting somebody who is a specialist in that. Antidepressant, Chirag, there will be a lot of patients on SSRI, right, who come to you as well. What is the general recommendation you give to them in terms of,
they see
yeah,
they end up losing weight. That's not a problem, but they
yes,
find it a bit difficult compared to
yes,
other people.
correct.
And I always ask the doctor or the patient itself to try to wean it off as soon as possible, so that you get the most benefit out of your workout and exercise and diet protocols.
Yes. So, and even within the psychiatric medications, there are ones which are weight neutral. There are one which actually lead to lose loss of weight as well. So there could be, again, in that case, like Chirag said, there could be mental health specialists and psychiatrists who should be on board here,
Yeah.
and who can probably help your patient. See, everybody needs to kind of work at a goal, right? So when you have a patient who's trying to lose weight, we need to work with their psychiatrist as well, right? Talk to them. Maybe again, talking sometimes works. Talk to them that can we do something in terms of maybe giving another antidepressant? It works.
So also,
Okay. Yes.
just one more thing for the SSRIs. I was on SSRIs for 2 years, and I specifically asked my doctor that I'm into fitness. I cannot afford to gain weight unnecessary. So he put me on a very low dosage on different kind of medication that did not obstruct anything or.
Yeah. So it's very much possible. And again, very rightly said, Chirag. And again, another thing is that there's another aspect of it. Again, don't stigmatize that as well, right? That's something you have to be very important, because mental health is as important for somebody's well-being. So again, something so again, don't put a stigma to that. Also, it's that's equally important. I think we should all. It's something which is equally important to discuss openly, which is great. Sana has said high ESR, CRP, and inflammation affects weight gain. Yes, it does. Rather than weight gain, it leads to one of the consequences of weight gain is chronic inflammation. Chirag, you heard of this? Now a lot of talk on chronic inflammation. What's your take on inflammation and
All those
because now a lot
anti-inflammatory.
of science is going there, especially with GLPs coming, right? So
Many people are getting into anti-inflammatory diets and all. There is nothing like that in the.
yes.
It's all marketing fad. It just, if you eat well, if you work out regularly, your inflammation will go down. But see, if you work out, your inflammation will go up temporary, but over the period of time, it will go down.
Yeah. So there is a component of chronic inflammation in obese people, which also leads to one very important consequence, which is atherosclerosis, which leads to heart attack and stroke. So that's something you have to be aware about. Dr. Sanjeev Gulati, sir, has said that a few type 1 patients develop obesity when they reach adolescence. Yes, that's true, sir. So what happens, Chirag, adolescence is a period when a lot of these children actually hit insulin resistance. Now, whether even a type 1, a lot of people misunderstand that even a type 1 child can develop insulin resistance, right? So that can happen in children, and they hit this insulin resistance. Sometimes, what happens is that, especially when they're well controlled with the type 1 diabetes, they become like normal children in a sense, and they gain a lot of weight. So it is very common phenomena, sir. And in fact, it becomes very difficult to treat this patient, a type 1 child, during adolescence because of the severe insulin resistance. And one, again, a little bit of my own personal thing. Again, don't quote me on this anywhere, but Sanjeev sir. But what I say is that some of these children, actually, we give them a small dose of metformin also, because it helps. So that typically cuts some of the insulin resistance and insulin dose requirement, cuts a vicious cycle, which is helpful. So that's my take on that. Anupama is asked, this is the last question we'll take. things like perfumes, air fresheners, toilet cleaners are now considered obesogens. What's your advice on that? We did cover this a bit, Chirag, but again, I think it's a very important topic. A few more insights from you on these environmental obesogens.
I always advise people not to choose or use any cheap products, because those products, if they are
Yes,
not licensed, they might be using some sort of chemicals which you are not aware of. And always try to buy
correct.
reputed brands and always read the label. Try to Google or ChatGPT yourself about those ingredients in it. You will come to know if that is safe for you or not.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great way of looking at good solution to that. So I think yeah, we have actually run out of questions now. So I think we had a great session. Chirag, thanks. Thank you for being part of this. And guys, we're going to have the next session next week, Tuesday, same time. What we're going to discuss next time, Chirag, is the matrix of it, right? Like the mathematics of obesity, right? So BMIs, waist circumferences, waist hip ratios, waist to height ratios, all kinds of body composition analysis and DEXA scans and everything. So stay tuned for that. A lot of mathematics coming up, but very interesting ones. It will be useful, very useful in your if you're considering or already practicing in this space. It'll be very useful. So please do check us out next week. You will get an email if you're already signed up here. So you'll get an email, a follow-up email from Zoom. So just watch out for that, and we'll be posting it on socials as well. So yeah, thank you, Chirag, and yeah, cool.
Thank you, Dr.
See you. Bye.
Bye,
Good
everyone.
night. Good night.